I'm Kelli Lemon.
And I'm Michael Paul Williams.
And welcome to the After the Monuments podcast, where we look at events and news about race in a historical context and see how, too often, history repeats itself.
Before we get started, After the Monuments is proud to receive support from VCU Massey Cancer Center. Massey Cancer Center wants you to imagine a future without cancer. All it takes is one, a revolutionary idea, a promising clinical trial, or a new breakthrough. See how Massey is developing new approaches to prevent and treat cancer for every person in every community. Learn more about this future for everyone at masseycancercenter.org.
Welcome to another episode of After the Monuments, a real talk about race with Michael Paul Williams and myself, Kelli Lemon. Today we have a great conversation by an author, artist, a creative, a storyteller, Linda Villarosa. Her book is called Under the Skin. Linda, welcome to After the Monuments.
It seems to me that a central kind of conceit of the book is that systemic racism in America is bad for our health.
Yes.
How do we? I'm just recalling the book and all of the resistance that you encountered to this very idea. The previous president of the United States was resistant to the idea that systemic racism even exists, as are many elected officials. How do we address this when so many people are not even convinced that systemic racism is a problem?
I'm a glass half full kind of person. And so I would say many more people are open to the idea than there used to be. Certainly because of what happened with the pandemic, when we saw, which was a surprise to no one who has been studying racial health disparities in America, that we had worse health outcomes, higher death rates and more hospitalization rates right away with COVID. And so everyone who had been, especially those who have been looking at other viruses like HIV/AIDS, were like, this is going to hit Black folks really hard. And when that happened, it was confirming, just like you were talking about. Also, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor shouldn't have to be murdered to have people recognize that there are, Black people die in America in a state-sanctioned way by the police. But certainly we saw that and it was clear. So whereas in the past, organizations and colleges and places like the agencies were afraid to call racism a public health threat, now it's much more common to see that kind of language and to have people having important discussions like the ones that I tried to have in my book.
Your personal evolution, your background as a writer is steeped in publications and writings that preach the gospel of self-help when it came to wellness. And part of this idea that, our health is something we can control and it's our responsibility. And if we do certain things, we'll be okay. Describe your evolution on that idea.
Well, first, my family was, a family of strivers. Our family came, like so many others, during the Great Migration. My grandparents came up from Mississippi to Chicago. Then my parents got out of Chicago and we lived in suburban Denver. And so we saw ourselves as these striving people who have we have control of everything in our lives if we work hard enough and we get enough education, which I still in some ways believe, but now I see that there is something more sinister going on in America that we have to pay attention to, and that's systemic and institutional racism. My background as the health editor of Essence magazine, I was very much about lift as we climb, that kind of thing. And sort of each one teach one. And my belief really firmly was, if I knew about racial health disparities, I knew that Black people had poor health outcomes in basically every area from birth to death. But I thought, if we just give Black women who read Essence magazine, and remember, it was like 8 million, that's a very deep reach of a group of people. If we give them enough information, we'll be able to sort of educate our way out of this situation. And then little by little, I started to realize, wait, I'm not talking about the systemic and the institutional problems. I'm only expecting individuals to, take care of themselves and to take care of the community without looking at other factors. And so as I evolved, I think my thinking evolved, and I just became a bit more political, if you will.
Been right here, Linda, and talk a little bit about you talked about the education, and one of the things that Michael Paul and I talk about on the show is the things that happened before the monuments were put up are still happening as these monuments are coming down in whatever narrative or form you want these monuments to be for you. Henrietta Lacks and the importance of her body. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that was some people, and when I say some people's, college age students started to read that book and were introduced to that book, and then they were introduced to how Black bodies were used in health and science, but never got any recognition for it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think Henrietta Lacks is a very interesting case because she's sort of the opposite of the usual narrative about the Black body. Usually it's that something about us is inferior. But with her, she had like superpower cells that were able to be used to great purpose. She died without, having her cells being used without her knowledge. She passed away very young. And then her cells have gone on to make great scientific discoveries and to help a lot of people. It has only been recently that she got the recognition that she deserved, and that she got, her family received recognition and remuneration. And I'm excited about that. But this is a through line that has gone on with Black people since the enslavement days, where our bodies are used to help others without us getting credit or recognition.
Also using our bodies, but not being able to help and serve us when it comes to some of the things that you described in your book, especially chapter 3, something about being Black is bad for your body and your baby, in terms of just women's health and prenatal health. Can you get into that a little bit as well?
Well, I think that was really hard for me to accept. When I first heard the numbers about maternal mortality in America, it started with, oh, did you know, someone saying to me, did you know that America is the only wealthy country where the numbers of women who die or almost die in childbirth is rising? This was in 2017. I was like, oh, really? How is that happening? How are people dying in childbirth? So then the second one was, well, it's driven by Black women who are 3 to 4 times more likely to die. And I said these words. I said, oh, is it extremely poor women? Is that it? Where are they? What's happening? That seems so unfair. And they said, wait a minute, it's not just poor Black women. It is if a Black woman with a master's degree or more is more likely to die or almost die or lose her baby than a white woman with an 8th grade education. So while the usual narrative is, oh, if you're poor, then something bad happens to you in America because of your poverty. But what if it isn't just because of poverty, which is also entangled with race and racism, but sometimes it is explicitly linked to racism. Here's something I noticed is I got 2 really wonderful reviews for my book last week, one in the New York Times and the other in the Washington Post. Both of the reviewers talked about their experiences with maternal, with near miss, which is when a woman almost dies. And with the gentleman for the Washington Post, his baby died and his wife was hemorrhaging. And he thinks that the medical providers really didn't listen to them. And then the woman from the Times had a really difficult birth, though she says she did everything right. And this is a Black woman. So I'm thinking, well, wait, both of the reviewers are also saying this. We've got to start listening to each other's stories and making a difference in this area.
In the book, you were talking about the case of Serena Williams, who would be more in tune with their body than an athlete like Serena, and how the doctors were not listening to her regarding her history of blood clots and so forth. What is it about Black women in this situation and Black people in general that the healthcare professionals are unwilling to listen to them?
Well, here's the story that really got me, and I include it in the last chapter of my book, which is about COVID, and it's the case of Dr. Susan Moore. So she's a physician. She works in Indiana. She gets COVID. She is hospitalized. She has tubes in her nose. She's lying in the hospital bed. And because she's a physician, she knows what to do for COVID. So she's suggesting to the medical providers, maybe we should have this treatment, maybe that. And they ignored her. Then she had extreme pain and they didn't give her pain medication. And she said it was because they treated her like she was drug seeking, like she was a drug addict. So what she did was she made a video of herself and put it up on Facebook from her hospital bed. She ended up leaving that hospital, but then she died. And her refrain of her video was, "This is how Black people get killed." And in an investigation that the hospital did, one of the factors they cited was the medical staff was intimidated by her medical knowledge. So why is it that when we do have the information, when we do know what's best, you're a doctor, you're trained in this, then you're still not listened to? So that to me is really scary. And that didn't happen, in the 1800s. That happened, 2 years ago.
Back to a conversation that we've had numerous times on this show, Michael Paul, trust. We just we don't trust a lot of things as Black folks in America. And, it's very hard to get us to go to the doctor, right? To seek this. And then once we do, if you're not listening to us, where do we go from here? Right, Linda?
It's really interesting because sometimes we're talking about medical distrust, especially when it came out around the COVID-19 vaccine. People were saying, in conversations with me, oh, it's because of the Tuskegee experiment. And I'm just like, well, the Tuskegee experiment was terrible, but it did end in the 70s. It isn't about that. It's about what happened to you, your loved ones, in the medical setting yesterday, in current time. And this has been so well documented. Sometimes people will ask me, well, do you have proof of this? I was like, I'm not giving you any more proof because this is so well proven, but now they can read my book and see the proof because I got it all in one place. But I get really frustrated. It's like, we don't need any more proof. We don't need any more data. We don't need any more research. We need some change right now because it's already been well documented and there's plenty of evidence that we do not get treated the same when we enter the medical setting.
The saddest part of the book, or one of the saddest aspects, is that continuum in which we have sterilizations dating back to enslavement and sterilizations in the very recent past at a Georgia immigration detention facility. And so many of this seems focused or it seems to be done to women of color, not just Black women, Mexican women, Puerto Rican women, Native American women. And I can't help but shake all of that in the context of this great replacement theory that we're dealing with, where there's this feeling that this fear in America that it is being overtaken by people of color. I don't know. It just helped me with that. It just seems like I'm not trying to be conspiratorial, but it just seems like we are at that place where, our very reproductive continuum is jeopardized.
Here's what I think, because I said I'm a glass half full. So I think that the more we know and we're aware of this, the more we can fight back. And what I see, which is the flip side of this, because I do believe exactly what you're saying, but I also see more people aware of this. I was really heartened by, I interviewed a lot of medical students around the country, and I see them much more political, much more outspoken than medical students used to be in the past. And I'm really excited that we're entering a future with a new kind of healthcare provider, whether it's a doctor, nurse, public health policymakers that are much more educated and unwilling to enter, the future with these old ideas, without examining all of our implicit biases. And that made me really happy. And it's really interesting to see them trying to make change in both education and training, even while they're in medical school, which is extremely hard. So that was a bright light when I was doing the research for this book. And I was really kind of attaching myself to these medical students because I felt like this is the future we need.
Before I kick it back to Kelli, and this is a 2020, this is a new publication, your book, 2022, but I have a suspicion that it went to print before the Roe versus Wade just the news that Roe versus Wade is on borrowed time. Given that Black women are 3 times more likely to experience maternal mortality, and everything that your book goes into, how do you feel about just the idea that there could be these restrictions on abortion?
I think this is all tangled together. So eugenics, restricting abortion, all of these things are enmeshed. And how I think about it is through the lens of reproductive justice. So reproductive justice is a Black-led and created way to think about things. And it's only 3. It's 3 things. All women have the right to have a baby. So you can't sterilize people against their will. All people have the right to not have a baby. So you have to have reproductive choice. And then all people have the right to raise children in healthy, safe environments. Those are the 3 tenets of reproductive justice. And so that's how I think of it. But I think reproductive injustice, they're all tied together, which is about controlling people's lives and their fertility.
Real quick, After the Monuments is proud to thank Team Henry Enterprises for their support of our show. Team Henry Enterprises is a Black-owned contracting firm specializing in office, retail, medical, multifamily, and higher education construction of all scopes and sizes. In the wake of the George Floyd protest, Team Henry is the very firm contracted by the city of Richmond to take down the Confederate monuments in Richmond and by many other municipalities to remove other Confederate monuments around Virginia and throughout the Southeast. Learn more about Team Henry and how they can help your community rebuild, renovate, or design at teamhenryent.com. Can you talk a little bit about alternative ways to get our health care? An example is the rise in doulas, especially Black doulas. I have seen a lot here in the Richmond region. And as a woman that's a little bit older, in terms of I'm over my 40s and I do not have a child, but I can still have one if I choose to. My only route would be a doula at this point, just because of the research that I've done. Can you talk about those alternative healthcare providers?
I would say doulas and midwives. So a doula is a person, generally a woman, who helps a birthing person during the pregnancy, the labor, and then the time after, mostly with breastfeeding. So I love after I wrote my 2018 story in the New York Times Magazine, Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Death Crisis, I got really excited about people telling me I'm going to become a doula, especially Black women. And they're not doulas used to be sort of out of reach of people who weren't wealthy, but now there are these doulas who are more social justice oriented. I know you're out of Virginia, and I wanted to tell you that I was in Virginia with my nieces. She had a fencing match. So I ran into this really wonderful woman, and she said, "Oh, do you know Linda Villarosa from the New York Times?" I said, "I'm her." And she said, "I run a nursing school, and the nurses in training have to do a kind of a community service project. And I wanted to add becoming a doula as the community service project. So this is at Old Dominion. So they ended up starting the doula program as part of this community service. And then I went and met the first class of them and cut the little ribbon and gave them their certificates. And it was so exciting. So I think, I'm always really happy when my magazine articles, and hopefully this book too, can make that kind of change that spurs people into saying, no, we need more doulas who understand, who are not just in it for the money, who are in it to help, and who have a reproductive justice frame thinking. And that's one of the other things that really excites me.
Brought up the conversation about people thinking that they can't afford them, because doula is such. I mean, it's the when you hear the word, most people are like, well, what is that? And then it sounds expensive a little bit, or to have a midwife, or that you had to hire someone. But there are so many social activists and social advocates out here that are in that space that are helping Black women in this area. So I'm glad that you brought up the disparities in the finance part of childbirth.
The other thing is more and more you can get it covered. You can get doula services covered by your health insurance, or even in some states, in some states are trying to get doulas covered by, say, Medicaid. And so that is a really, really good step in the right direction.
From the Black healthcare providers, I am blessed to say that all of my healthcare providers are Black. They all are women, even down to my dentist. But that was hard. It was hard for me to find. It was hard for me to find in my network. Is there any advice, or is there anything that you would want to say to Black healthcare providers of or how they can be more visible, or how they could make sure that their practices are known to, a majority of the population?
I think what I want to say to them is thank you. It's really hard to get through medical education and training. I teach at the City University of New York here in New York City. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn. And next semester, I'm not teaching journalism. I chose to teach at the medical school. And part of it is because of it's very hard to get through medical school if you're a regular Black person. Many of us did not have, our dad wasn't a doctor. And so, or we don't have that kind of red carpet into medical education and training. So I'm really excited for that. And I think that, I support your decision to do that, to really go through the extra work of seeking out providers that look like us. And that's really important to support them. I would say, please stay in, don't, stay in school and make it through, and then find ways to, attach yourself to community service and attach yourself to, sort of being the public expression, because that's really important that we also see each other so that we encourage other students to also go into medicine.
When we talk about weathering, we're talking about kind of how racism in America kind of has turned our body against us. But there are external assaults that you talk about in the book. Can you talk about the role environmental racism is playing on our health conditions? We have a neighborhood here in Richmond, Gilpin Court. It's a public housing community, and it's 5.5 miles from another neighborhood, predominantly white, more affluent, called Westover Hills. 5.5 miles apart, and the life expectancy is 20 years. The difference in the life expectancy is 20 years. And I was astonished to read in your book that there's a community in Chicago, Inglewood, that is 9 miles from a place called Streeterville, where the life expectancy is 30 years difference. Can you talk about the role that environment and environmental racism plays in our life chances and just our overall health?
Well, there's a term called the social determinants of health, and it's kind of like a wonky public health term, but it means that it describes communities. So it describes safety in a community, clean water, fresh air, not polluted air, the ability to have green space so that you could go outside and exercise, having healthy food choices, healthy, affordable food in your community. And if you are lacking these things, including also schools, it counts for schools. If your schools aren't good, if the stores don't have fresh, healthy food, if you can't exercise, if housing is crumbling, that is a community that is unhealthy. That's how I like to think of it. My mother is from Inglewood. My family came from Mississippi and landed there, and it was a promised land. But then it became not a promised land. It became a very unhealthy place. And when my mother and I went to visit, I was shocked at how it looked. Her school was boarded up, where she went to school with Lorraine Hansberry and Gwendolyn Brooks. The school was boarded up. Her elementary school wasn't there. Even the school that I went to before we moved was all the area around it was boarded up. And there weren't a lot of healthy choices, but there were a lot of there was danger in the community. Where we were staying in Streeterville in a hotel, and it was stark. So I understood why there's that 30-year difference in life expectancy. But what I don't like is when the communities themselves get blamed for what happened. to Inglewood was redlined, so people weren't able to get mortgages. On top of that, there was contract buying, which meant even my grandfather could not buy a home without having it be on contract. So that meant he had no equity into it. If he missed payments, he could lose the home. So that sapped so much Black wealth out of that Black community. And that's not people's fault. It's nobody's fault. That is sanctioned by economics and by the government. And so that's what I like to think of, is to think, stop blaming us for the problems that we have and start having more compassion and empathy and start looking into the history of what happens to places that are quote unquote unhealthful to live in. And those communities are much more subject to a manufacturing or a facility moving in that also pollutes the area because it has been devalued.
Yeah, the saga of Duke Energy, that was heartbreaking, and its impact on that community in North Carolina. You quote in the book W.B. Du Bois saying, in effect, there are few cases in the history of civilization where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. He's talking about America. And I'm glad you're a glass half full person, because I need that right now. Given, in my view, the very unlikely happenstance that systemic racism will disappear in my lifetime, how do we get at this? I mean, the racism's killing us, but the racism shows no signs of going away. What are we to do?
I had this really interesting intergenerational conversation with my family. So my mother's 91, my children are in their 20s, and I'm in between. So my mom was sort of like an old school bootstrapper, because she's still in that headset. And it was her 90th birthday. And so then I'm more like the progressive, idealistic. And my children are abolitionists. They're like, overthrow, turn over everything. Let's just destroy and rebuild it. And I loved that conversation that we had. And we all came out, I came out thinking, I am so glad that we have younger folks who think differently. I'm so glad we have progressive people like me and like my friend circle and network, and like you, where we're thinking, what can we do? We don't want to be stuck in this. Maybe one step is just getting Black healthcare providers and talking about that. Another step is having your fantastic podcast. And then, my mom kind of got dragged along in that conversation, her and her 90 years young. And I love that. And I think that when we grapple with these issues and we agree that we'll help each other, we agree that we'll support each other, I, really believe in that. And I also see, I was really an outlier writing about this stuff, even a few years ago. And now I get invited to a lot of groups of journalists, young journalists, students like that I teach, and also people just out of school, to say, how do we do the kind of reporting that you do? And I can see their little wheels turning, going, ooh, I want to make a difference. And you did not get, when I was coming up, starting to be a journalist, it was all about how you do you and get ahead. So I love that there's this lens, the sort of a making a difference journalism, and making a difference medical students, and my kids making a difference. And so I really see that as a big hope for the future.
I view it as a service. I want to thank you for this. I could never quite articulate why I found so disquieting what seemed to be almost a progressive trope that our battle is class-based. It's not race-based. If we solve the class issue, everything will take care of itself. And I never really bought into that. I think they're two distinct problems. And I think your research in your book proves that these are things that defy class explanation and class-based solutions. When a Black woman with an advanced degree is at much more peril from a childbirthing standpoint than a white woman with an 8th grade education. So can you speak to the class versus race debate?
I certainly was much more, interested in class at the beginning of my career. And I was honest about that in my book because I see other people still into that lens. But if we have these examples of people, including the two book reviewers who are certainly not, they are people who are highly educated. The reviews were beautifully written, but both of them experienced race-based problems when just trying to have a baby. And so that alone, I document as best I can, part of my sort of back goal is to say, please don't only look at class. You have to look at race. And that is what Dr. Harold Freeman taught me, in the early 90s. And I really listened to him. He said, if you do that, you're making a mistake. And certainly the other thing is class and race in America are, wrapped up together. There are large numbers of poor Black people because of racism. Our communities are not as healthy because of racism. And so you can't separate them in many cases, but then sometimes you actually can. And so it's sort of a complicated thing because I think, when I was first starting in my career, that's how we were taught. It was like, there are poor Black people that we have to help, and we're separate from them. So that was my thinking. And now I'm like, well, no, we're not separate from them. Even if you're educated and you have health insurance and other means, you can still have a hard time in America and in general and in the healthcare system. And so, we have to grapple with this. And it's more complicated than just saying poor people get sick, because that's not, that should not be a truism. And also it's cruel. Poor people, nobody should get sick. This is America. We're supposed to be equal. We're supposed to have equal justice. So we have to, think about these things and fight pushback.
We could probably talk to you for another hour. However, we do have to wrap up this conversation. And then the final comments, and I wish we had more time to talk about this. You do talk about the emotional pain, and we got to talk a little bit about mental health and how that also is just, affecting the Black community. And you spoke about your mother, and, that's one thing about those that are in the 90 or even, 80-year-olds. They do not want you to talk about mental health. They do not want you to share our business with someone else. Can we just very quickly talk about how we can help with our mental health crisis and how this emotional pain is still affecting us?
I think one of the things I looked at in my book was this through line from the enslavement days that Black people have this kind of superpower against pain, that we have extreme high pain tolerance, and that is a through line to today. But in the past, part of the myth that we have high pain tolerance was we were immune to emotional pain. So that's why it was okay during the slavery times to take our children away, to kill our family members in front of us. And so that is clearly not true, but even we have internalized that. And so that's why there's a thing called the, strong Black woman. And that it's hard for us to show vulnerability, but it's also hard for us to be seen as vulnerable. So that when we have an emotional health crisis or a mental health problem, it looks like crazy or dangerous or something like that, rather than something that needs to be tended to cared for, that we need treatment, not incarceration. And so that's the thing that really bothers me about that. The other thing that we're lacking is mental health. We're same where we're lacking mental health care, healthcare providers in general that look like us. We're really lacking mental health care providers. My mother was actually trained as a psychiatric social worker. And so we have a lot of sort of therapists in my family. So I grew up with sitting around the table talking about people, not in the talking about people, but talking about people and the problems that my mother was seeing when in her early career. And I remember that, that's really important to me personally, but also that people don't be ashamed to seek out. We're not invulnerable, and it's not great to be always strong. And it's okay to seek help. And I covered that in my book, with looking at a woman who was just trying so hard to be strong until she really, went down in a suicide crisis. She survived, she's fine, but it was really difficult for her to get help. And then I cover a man who had bipolar disorder, a friend of my family, who was killed by the police because he was seen as dangerous rather than ill. And so that is important that's an important thing in America. And we've seen more and more of that over the past couple of years, where people are killed by the police because they are struggling with mental health issues, but they're seen as dangerous.
Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. Can you tell everyone that's listening where they can find your book? And more importantly, where will you be over the summer talking about your book that they can get tuned in and listen to as well?
Thank you for that. My book is called Under the Skin. It's on sale June 14th. So today's Monday, it's tomorrow. This is crazy time for me. I'm really excited. I launch tomorrow in New York at St. Anne's Warehouse with a small people of color owned bookstore called Café con Libros. Then I go to North Carolina. Then I do a virtual thing in Atlanta. Then I'm super excited because I go to Montgomery, Alabama, where I love and where the Relf sisters live, where, I covered them in my book. They were forcibly sterilized in 1973. They're 60-year-old women who I cannot wait to see. Then I go to New Orleans. So I'll be all over the place, but I'm really excited. You can buy my book at your favorite independent bookstore, or you can order on Amazon, but please get it. And I love this stuff. I know it can be sad, but we have to grapple with it and look toward a better future.
Congratulations to you. This is, as I said earlier, this is such an important book and to my thinking, essential reading. And I thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me this time to discuss it.
Thank you, Linda. And once again, you're listening to After the Monuments, a real talk about race with Michael Paul Williams and Kelli Lemon. We will talk to you guys. After the Monuments is a Virginia Video Network production and produced by Matt Pachilli, Michael Paul Williams, and me, Kelli Lemon. Technical direction and editing from Bill Barksdale. Executive production from Paul Farrell, Diane Salvatore, and Paige Mudd. Will Royer provides studio support. Our artwork is by Krishna Mathis. I'm Kelli Lemon, and we'll see you next week on After the Monument.